Chapter 18. Bad Environmental and Resource Scares. Perhaps the most disappointing aspect of the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge pollution debate is the false information being disseminated by well-meaning zealots who oppose any human activity on the coastal plain. Do they believe that their cause is so just that they are above and beyond the truth? Walter Hickel, former governor of Alaska, 1991. Here's the plan for this chapter. First comes a list of the known killers. Next are mentioned a few phenomena whose effects are in question. Then comes a long list of threats which scared many people when first made public, and still frighten many, but which have now been thoroughly disproven. The refutations are not given here, but references are given for most. Last is brief discussion of acid rain, the ozone layer, and global warming. Known killers. These are important pollutions that certainly can kill many. Plague, malaria, the worst killer in the 19th century into the 20th century. Typhus, tropical yellow fever, encephalitis, dengue fever, elephantiasis, African sleeping sickness, river blindness, and dozens of other diseases carried by insects, often through the air. Cholera, dysentery, typhoid fever carried by polluted water, leprosy, tuberculosis, smallpox, and other epidemic diseases. Spoiled food, botulism and other ills from primitive preparation and lack of proper storage. Cigarettes, tobacco causes 25 to 40% of all cancer deaths in the U.S. Poor diet causes perhaps 35% of all cancer deaths in the U.S. High doses of medical x-rays. Dust particulates and smoke from burning coal and wood. Overuse of almost anything, for example, alcohol and drugs. Guns, autos, ladders. Work-related exposure to formaldehyde, EDB, Bhopal-type chemical accidents, and Capone, Chernobyl-like nuclear accidents due to carelessness and bad design. Coal mining, police work, and firefighting. War, homicide, suicide, forced starvation, and other deaths caused by human predators. Possibly dangerous threats. These are some phenomena which may be dangerous, but whose effects, if any, are not well understood. Too much ozone in Southern California, see Chapter 15 Rekrupnik and Portney. Low-voltage electric and magnetic fields around power lines and appliances. There is no known evidence of damage to health from either. They are listed in this section only because some reputable scientists are still asking for more research on the subjects, although others say it is a waste of funds. Questionable issues. These are phenomena whose dangers have been alleged. They have not been supported by any solid evidence, but have not yet been conclusively disproven. 1900s, 1990s, global warming. To 1990s, ozone layer. See discussion to follow. 1992, big drop in sperm count since 38. A Danish study asserts drop of almost 25% in human sperm count in past half-century. PCBs are said to be the cause by some experts. Would anyone care to bet on whether this new scare turns out to be valid? 1992. Chlorinated water causing birth defects. Study finds that among 81,055 births in New Jersey, 56 were born with spinal defects, and 8 of those were born to women exposed to high levels of chlorine in the water. 2 or 3 would have been expected among this group if there were no effect. Since every medicine has side effects, and just about everything causes cancer in one fashion or another, it would not be surprising if chlorine does too. But given the sample size and the number of such possible effects that are examined by researchers, the odds are very high that this effect will be found not to exist. Yet it occasioned large newspapers' stories with headlines such as "Chlorination byproducts in water seen as risk during pregnancy." No mention is made in the article of the huge pollution-reducing effects of putting chlorine into the water. 1992. Study suggests electric razor use may raise risk of getting cancer. A study of 131 men who had leukemia. For readers some years in the future, you may test the plausibility of new scares then by checking whether this and other 1992 scares have been validated or disconfirmed by then. Also, only about 3 new cases of leukemia are reported per year per 100,000 people. And consider, too, are there any dangers from shaving with a straight-edge razor that are avoided with an electric razor? Definitely disproven threats. Earliest history to the present, land shortage. As nomadic groups grew, land scarcity increased. This led to agriculture. This is just the first in the sequences of technical advances. Population increase, new food or land scarcities, new advances described in chapters 5 and 6. BCE, running out of flint. Worries about running out of resources have been with us since the beginning of time. Shortages surely occurred in many places. Archaeologists studying two Mayan villages in Central America found that about 300 BCE, in the village far from plentiful flint supplies, there was much more conservation and innovation by reusing the flint in broken implements, compared to the village with plentiful flint nearby. The Neanderthals could produce 5 times more cutting edge from a block of flint as could their predecessors. And successors of the Neanderthals increased their efficiency to be produce 80 times as much cutting edge per block as the Neanderthals' predecessors. Eventually, flint was replaced by metal, and scarcity declined. This is the prototype of all resource scares. 1700 BCE, running out of copper. Iron was developed as a replacement for tool manufacture. 1200 BCE, tin. New sources were found from time to time. Bronze became increasingly scarce and high-priced in the Middle East and Greece because of a tin shortage, probably caused by a war-induced breakdown in long-distance trade. Ironworking and steelmaking techniques developed in response. 550 BCE, disappearing forests. The Greeks worried over the deforestation of their country, in part for lack of wood to build ships. When scarcity became acute, shipbuilders shifted to a new design that required less wood. Greece is well forested now. 1500s, 1600s, running out of wood for fuel. 1500s to 1700 CE, loss of trees in Great Britain. See Chapter 10 for outcome. Late 1700s, with the invention of lightning rods, came fear of electricity accumulating in Earth, B. Franklin's time. 1798, food, the Malthusian mother of all scares that warns, increasing population must lead to famine. Since then, there has been continuous improvement in average nutrition, see Chapter 5. 1800s, running out of coal in Great Britain. Jevons's book documented the scare. See Chapter 11 for outcome. 1850s and intermittently thereafter, running out of oil. See Chapter 12 for outcome. 1895 to 1910, rubber. Wild-grown public property supplies became exhausted and the price of rubber rose from 50 cents to $3. Plantations were established in response. Price fell back to 50 by 1910 and then went further down to 20s. 1900s, timber in the U.S. See Chapter 10 and Olson, 1971. 1922 to 1925, rubber again. British-Dutch cartels squeezed supplies and prices tripled. Increased scarcity provoked conservation in production, increased productivity on plantations, and recycling. Price returned to 20 and cartel was broken. Research on synthetics began as a result of the price run-up. 1930s, 1950s, 1980s in the U.S., other periods in other countries. Water. See Chapters 10 and 17. 1940-1945, rubber again. War cut supplies. The research on synthetics, induced by the earlier episode, was available for rapid development. 1945, DDT, sensationalized by Rachel Carson in 1962, said to cause hepatitis. Discontinued in U.S. in 1972. Known then to be safe to humans, caused death only if eaten like pancakes, some damage to wildlife under special conditions. With the aid of DDT, India had brought the number of malaria cases down from the estimated 75 million in 1951 to about 50,000 in 1961. Sri Lanka reduced malaria from about 3 million cases after World War II to just 29 in 1964. Then, as the use of DDT went down, endemic malaria returned to India like the turnaround of a tide. By 1977, the number of cases reached at least 30 million and perhaps 50 million. In 1971, amidst the fight that led to the banning of DDT in 1972, the president of the National Academy of Science, distinguished biologist Philip Handler, said DDT is the greatest chemical that has ever been discovered. Commission after commission, top expert after top Nobel Prize-winning expert, has given DDT a clean bill of health. 1950s, irradiated foods, now approved in 30 countries for various uses, approved in U.S. 1992. 1957 continues, fluoridated water. The arguments used against fluoridating water were eerily similar to those later used against nuclear power, but from the other end of political spectrum. 1960s, PCBs, banned in 1976. A side effect of banning PCBs is malfunctions in large electrical transformers. One such case caused the July 29, 1990 blackout covering 14 square miles in Chicago, leading to rioting and 3 deaths. Early 1960s, low-level nuclear radiation. Rather than being harmful, this was later shown to produce a beneficial effect called hormesis, see Chapter 13. November 1959, Thanksgiving cranberries and pesticides. Mid-1960s, mercury dental fillings. Declared safe in 1993 by U.S. Public Health Service. Mid-1960s, SST threat to ozone layer. 2 scientific flip-flops within a few years, see below. 1970, mercury in swordfish and tuna. 1970, cyclamates banned for causing bladder cancer. Totally cleared in 1985, but ban never lifted. 1972, red dye number 2. One Russian study claimed dye caused cancer. Many subsequent studies absolved the dye. Nevertheless, banned in 1976. 1970s and earlier, running out of metals, see chapters 1 to 3. 1970s, saccharin causing bladder cancer. Exonerated in 1990s, but warning still required on containers. Early 1970s, pesticides aldrin and dieldrin, suspended in 1974. Chlordane and heptachlor, all banned in the 1970s because of belief that they cause tumors in mouse livers. But there has never been a documented case of human illness or death in the United States as the result of the standard and accepted use of pesticides. Although Americans are exposed to trace levels of pesticides, there is no evidence that such exposure increases the risk of cancer, birth defects, or any other human ailment. 1970s, acid rain, shown in 1990s not to harm forests, see below. 1970s, Agent Orange, dioxin. Dioxin declared safe by federal court in 1984 when veterans brought suit. August 1991, New York Times front page headline was, U.S. backing away from saying dioxin is a deadly peril. The story continued. Exposure to the chemical, once thought to be much more hazardous than chain smoking, is now considered by some experts to be no more risky than spending a week sunbathing. Read the Agent Orange case. Virtually every major study, including a 1987 report by the Centers for Disease Control, CDC, has concluded that the evidence isn't strong enough to prove that the herbicide is the culprit in the bad health of some Vietnam veterans. Mid-1970s, humanity in danger because of a millennia-long reduction in the number of varieties of plants used for food, belied by evidence on famine prior to the 1970s and since then, as explained in the afternote to Chapter 6. 1976, chemical residues at Love Canal. Scare ended 1980. Solid scientific consensus is that there was no observable damage to humans from living near Love Canal. 1976, explosion of PCB plant in Seveso, Italy. The PCBs caused no harm to anyone. See the statement by Harun Tazieff on page 573. Mid and late 1970s, global cooling. By 1980s, replaced by the scare of global warming. See below. 1978, asbestos in schools and other buildings. The ill-considered regulations on the use of asbestos not only are costly, but have had a devastating side effect: the Challenger space shuttle disaster. The sealant used to replace the asbestos-based O-ring sealant in the rocket engine that launches space shuttles malfunctioned at the low temperature at which Challenger was launched, causing the explosion shortly after launch and deaths of the astronauts. As in many such cases, it is impossible to foresee all the consequences of an environmental regulation, and as David Hume and Friedrich Hayek teach us, we should be extremely wary of altering evolved patterns of behavior, lest we make such tragic blunders with our rational assessments of what our social interventions may bring about. For more on asbestos, see the 1992 article by Malcolm Ross, a hero in bringing to light the facts about asbestos, and Bennett's 1991 book. 1970s, 1980s, oil spills. The worst cases of oil spills have all been far less disastrous to wildlife than initially feared. 1980s, radon. Eventually, too little radon found dangerous rather than too much. 1979, lead ingestion by children lowers IQ. Study by Herbert Needleman led to the federal ban on leaded gasoline. Study entirely repudiated in 1994. No mention of again allowing leaded gasoline has been made, however. 1981, coffee said to cause 50% of pancreatic cancers. Original researchers reversed conclusion in 1986. Also, no connection found between caffeine intake of pregnant women and birth defects. 1980s, 1990s, BST, bovine somatotropin. Assertion that this growth-promoting element will make cows more liable to infection, proven false. 1981, malathion and medfly threat to agriculture in the West. Malathion found safe in 1981 as a medfly killer after its use had been threatened. 1982, Times Beach dioxin threat, found to have caused no harm to humans. In 1983, dioxin was cleared of charges. The Centers for Disease Control asserts that the Times Beach evacuation was unnecessary. 1984, ethyl dibromide, banned though no one harmed. Result, more dangerous pesticides used instead. Mid-1980s continues. Ozone hole. No connection found between thinner ozone layer and skin cancer. See below. 1986, warning of lead in drinking water. In December, retraction by EPA. 1987, alcohol said to be responsible for 50% increase in breast cancers. 1987, sand from Californian and other beaches. Silica was listed as a probable human carcinogen, and warnings were required by the state of California on containers of sand and limestone. Has been classified as carcinogenic by OSHA and other regulatory agencies. 1989, red dye number 3. This scare came and went in a hurry. Thelstilbestrol, cattle growth hormone said to cause cervical cancer. Banned. Only cause for fear was finding of vaginal cancer when DEs used in large doses as a human drug during pregnancy. 1989, aflatoxin in corn, another supposed threat to our food supply. 1989 alar. Nuclear winter. Atom bombs can surely kill us. But this threat to humanity as a whole was soon found to be shoddy science. 1991, smoke from Kuwait oil fires and global cooling. No global effects found. Fires in Kuwait not a threat to climate, federal study finds. First reports estimated an unprecedented ecological catastrophe, the likes of which the world has never seen, with 5 years required to extinguish all the fires. The last fire was extinguished within 6 months. 1991, left-handed people die earlier, proved unsubstantiated in 1993. False scare based on faulty age compositional data. 1993, cancer caused by cellular telephones. This scare is an excellent example of the scare epidemic. A single layman made the charge on a television talk show of a link between his wife's brain tumor and her use of cellular phones. That was enough to produce front-page stories for days, activity in Congress, the Food and Drug Administration, and the National Cancer Institute, plus statements by manufacturers that studies of the matter will be forthcoming. All scientists quoted have stated that there is no evidence of a connection. In the meantime, stock prices of firms in the industry fell substantially, the price of Motorola, the largest manufacturer, falling 20%, and many persons became fearful of using their phones. Given that the human imagination is active, and that there is no sanction for floating such scares, but there is a news value in them, there is every reason to expect many, many more false scares to proliferate, each one adding to the impression that the environment is a more and more frightening milieu. Hence, a brief digression. If you were to wear both a belt and suspenders, the chance of your suffering coincident failure, having both snap at once and your pants fall down, is one occurrence every 36,000 years. Reassuring people about environmental and resource scares is not easy. It is like reassuring a small child that night noises do not imply danger. You can investigate room after room with the child, but the fears reappear later and are directed to places you did not investigate. Perhaps vague fears are an ineradicable part of our nature, so long as we lack solid knowledge of the actual conditions. But policymakers must try to rise above the childish and primitive thinking of these scares and to gain the necessary knowledge so as not to make costly and destructive decisions. The possibility of a dangerous or unesthetic polluting effect may be raised against almost any substance humans have ever produced or ever will produce, and we cannot immediately rebut any such charge because it takes much time and research effort to get the facts. It only takes one sentence to accuse a person of murder or a substance of causing cancer, but it may take years and volumes to rebut the charge. It is clear that if we act as if all possible dangers from a substance are also likely dangers, and if we take seriously all charges even when there is little evidence presented to back them up, we will become immobilized. May I now introduce a surprise witness whose qualifications in the fight against pollution are formidable. Here is his congressional testimony about sodium azide, which is used in airbags for automobiles. He was responding to a report that this chemical may cause mutations and cancer. Sodium azide, if you smell the gas or taste it, is very, very unsafe. So is gasoline. So are the additives in gasoline. So are battery additives. So are tire wear and tire flakes that get into the air. So are hydrocarbons. So is nitrogen oxide, and so is carbon monoxide. It strikes me as eroding the credibility of some of these opponents who suddenly become full of such concern for these toxic substances because it happens to be in accord with what certain special industrial interests want, and so unconcerned with the massively more pervasive, massively more poisonous array of chemical substances that we too charitably call pollution. I also spoke with Dr. Bruce Ames, chairman at the genetics department at the University of California, Berkeley. Dr. Ames was merely talking about sodium azide as it is exposed to human contact. He is not talking about sodium azide as it is solidified in pellets and contained in sealed containers, etc. He does not have any information on that. The point I want to make is that sodium azide, if it is exposed to acidic contact, will under certain extraordinary circumstances, given the fact that it is a solid pellet, emit a hydrozoic acid gas, which is an intolerably pungent gas. If anybody has ever taken the slightest whiff of this gas, they would know it. In all the crashes, which involve airbag-equipped cars on the highways, and sodium azide as the inflator, there has been no such reaction. I don't say that by way of saying that sodium azide should be the inflator. Undoubtedly, it is likely that most of the cars with airbags in the 80s will not have sodium azide. But I do point out that the attempt to sensationalize this product in ways that are not shared by EPA, the Department of Health, Education and Welfare, or OSHA, who know how sodium azide has been used for years in medical laboratories, for example, your attempt to sensationalize it does not receive much credibility given the source of the persons who are doing the sensationalizing. The irony of this effective defense of sodium azide by Ralph Nader, for that is the identity of my surprise witness, is that the consumer and environmental movements in which Nader is influential have attacked many other substances and conditions in the same way that sodium azide and airbags were attacked. And now the same consumerists were suffering from irresponsible attacks on their own pet safety project, the airbag. Major environmental scares of the 1990s. Acid rain. The acid rain scare has now been exposed as one of the great false alarms of our time. In 1980, the federal government initiated the huge National Acid Precipitation Assessment Program, NAPAP, employing 700 scientists and costing $500 million. The NAPAP study found, to the surprise of most of its scientists, that acid rain was far less threatening than it had been assumed to be at the onset of the study. It is mainly a threat to a few lakes, about 2% of the lake's surface in the Adirondacks, all of which could be made less acid with cheap and quick liming. Furthermore, before 1860, when forests around those lakes began to be cut and wood burned, which lowers acidity, the lakes were as acid as now. The Clean Air Act of 1990, which will have large economic consequences for the U.S., was passed while the NAPAP findings were unknown to most or all of the Congress. The NAPAP director expressed disappointment in 1990 that the science that NAPAP performed has been so largely ignored. Indeed, the NAPAP findings were systematically kept from public view until the television program 60 Minutes aired a broadcast on the scandal. In Europe, the supposed effects of acid rain in destroying forests and reducing tree growth have now been shown to be without foundation. Forests are larger, and trees growing more rapidly than in the first half of this century. See Chapter 10. The acid rain scare reteaches an important lesson. It is quick and easy to raise a false alarm, but to quell the alarm is hard and slow. The necessary solid research requires considerable time, and by the time the research is complete, many people have a stake in wanting the scientific truth not to be heard. Advocacy organizations who gain public support from the alarm, and bureaucrats who have a stake in not being shown to have been in error and who already have built some empire on the supposed problem. Global warming. Along with acid rain and the ozone hole, addressed below, the supposed greenhouse effect and global warming must be mentioned in this book because it is so salient in public thinking. I am not an atmospheric scientist, and I cannot address the technical issues. I can, however, try to put these issues in reasonable perspective. Given the history of such environmental scares over all of human history, my guess is that global warming is likely to be simply another transient concern, barely worthy of consideration 10 years from now should I then be writing again of these issues. After all, when I first addressed environmental matters in the late 1960s and 1970s, the climatological issue of major public concern was still global cooling. These quotations illustrate the prevailing thinking about climate in the early 1970s, only a decade before the hoo-ha about warming began in earnest. Climatologist J. Murray Mitchell, then of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, noted in 1976, "The media are having a lot of fun with this situation. Whenever there is a cold wave, they seek out a proponent of the Ice Age's coming school and put his theories on page 1. Whenever there is a heat wave, they turn to his opposite number, who predicts a kind of heat death of the Earth. The cooling has already killed hundreds of thousands of people in poor nations. It has already made food and fuel more precious, thus increasing the price of everything we buy. If it continues and no strong measures are taken to deal with it, the cooling will cause world famine, world chaos, and probably world war, and this could all come by the year 2000. Lowell Ponte, The Cooling, 1976. The facts have emerged in recent years and months from research into past ice ages. They imply that the threat of a new ice age must now stand alongside nuclear war as a likely source of wholesale death and misery for mankind. Nigel Calder, former editor of New Scientist and producer of scientific television documentaries, In the Grip of a New Ice Age, International Wildlife. July 1975. At this point, the world's climatologists are agreed. Once the freeze starts, it will be too late. Douglas Colligan, Brace Yourself for Another Ice Age, Science Digest, February 1973. I believe that increasing global air pollution through its effect on the reflectivity of the Earth is currently dominant and is responsible for the temperature decline of the past decade or two. Reed Bryson, Environmental Roulette, Global Ecology, Readings Toward a Rational Strategy for Man, John P. Holdren and Paul R. Ehrlich, 1971. Bryson went so far as to tell the New York Times that, compared to the then recent decade or two of cooling, there appears to be nothing like it in the past 1,000 years, implying that cooling was inevitable. Indeed, many of the same persons who were then warning about global cooling are the same climatologists who are now warning of global warming, especially Stephen Schneider, one of the most prominent of the global warming doomsters. It is interesting to reflect on the judgments that would be made in, say, 1996 of past decisions if the world had followed the advice of the climatologists only 2 years earlier, who then urged the world to take immediate steps to head off the supposed cooling threat. Should we not be glad that governments did not listen to the anti-cooling advice they were given in the 1970s? And therefore, is it reasonable now to trust the forecasts of those very scientists who have been systematically wrong in every doomsaying prediction that they have made, as is true of the environmental spokespersons of the past 2 decades, who are up in arms about global warming. Curiously, within days after I first wrote the above paragraph, there appeared a newspaper story entitled "Volcano Reverses Global Warming. Scientists expect mean temperature to drop 1 degree over 2 to 4 years." The event in question was the eruption in June 1991 of Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines. Then, within a few days more, there appeared a scholarly article finding that smoke particles may lead to cooling rather than warming, as had previously been assumed. Or do I have it backwards? No matter. Whether the climate models will be right about Mount Pinatubo or not, and about the cooling effect of smoke particles, is in question, of course. The problem here, as with the global warming issue generally, is that our planet contains many forces about which we as yet know very little, and which we can predict little, if at all. For example, volcano eruptions. It is an act of hubris and great imprudence to proceed as if we know much more than we do, when a single article in a single journal can undermine our basic conclusions. All that can be done within the scope of the available space and of my non-expert's knowledge is to give the following quick list of propositions about the issue. Before the concerned reader concludes that the following treatment is simply a whitewash, it would be fair to examine the state of one's own knowledge on the subject, what you know about technical facts, and the sources of the supposed information. The basis of most people's thoughts on the subject is simply general newspaper stories that assert that a problem exists. In the following summary of the facts, I rely heavily on Balling's book. 1. All climatologists agree that there has been an increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide in recent decades, but there is great disagreement about the implications, if any, of the CO trend for global temperature. In the late 1980s, the range of thinking ran from those who believed that there will be warming of up to 10 degrees Fahrenheit by the next mid-century, to those who argued that the evidence is so mixed that one cannot predict any warming at all. By 1994, the range had come down somewhat at the top, but there is still great disagreement. 2. Even those who predict warming agree that any likely warming would not be great relative to year-to-year variability and would be swamped by long-run natural variability over the millennia. The high-end estimate climatologists have also scaled back their estimates of a possible rise in sea level due to glacial and polar ice melting from several feet to at most a few inches. Those who foresee warming rely heavily on computer simulation models. Many of those who foresee little or no warming rely on the temperature data for the past century. And many of the skeptics of global warming believe that the simulation models lack solid theoretical basis and are built on shaky ad hoc assumptions. Skeptics also point to the absence of correlation between past carbon dioxide buildup and the temperature record. 4. Even if warming will occur, it is likely to be uneven in time and place. More of the effect would be at night than day, more in the low sun season and less in the high sun season, and more in the Arctic regions than in the tropical parts of the world. It should be noted that these effects are less unwelcome than if the effects were in the opposite parts of the daily cycle and the planet's geography. 5. If there is warming, it will occur over many decades, during which period there will be much time for economic and technical adjustment. 6. Any necessary adjustments would be small relative to the adjustments that we make during the year to temperature differences where we reside and as we travel. A trip from New York to Philadelphia, or spring coming a day or two earlier than usual, is not very different than the temperature gradient for any likely warming within the next century. 7. The necessary adjustments would be far, far smaller than the effects of the advent of air conditioning in any of the places in this world where that device commonly is found. The alterations that air conditioning, let alone central heating, make in the environment in which we spend our hours dwarf any alterations required by any conceivable global warming. 8. If there is warming, and if one is worried about it, the clear policy implication would be the substitution of nuclear fission for the burning of fossil fuels. This would have other benefits as well, of course, especially the lives saved from air pollution and coal mining. Does this calm assessment differ from the impression you get from the news? One can gauge the effectiveness of the mass media in creating public opinion on global warming and other doomsday subjects by the increase in just a single year in the proportion of the public that were aware of the global warming issue. From 59% in 1988 to 79% in 1989.66. There is no way that individuals can measure for themselves the extent of global warming. Hence, their thinking is labile and easily influenced by television and newspapers. Then the politicians and the environmental activists who give scare stories to the press cite public opinion as a reason to change public policy. Assessing global warming seems more and more like assessing the likely availability of raw materials. Every alarm about scarcity has been a case of speculative theory not fitted to the historical data. The alarm about greenhouse warming seems to come from those who pay attention only to various theoretical models, just as the alarm about global cooling came only from theoretical models in the 1970s, and from some of the same persons who were alarmed then. Whereas those who focus on the historical temperature record seem unconvinced that there have been unusual changes and are quite unworried about the future. With respect to natural resources, the conclusion is inescapable that those who have believed the historical record have been correct, and those who have believed theories without checking them against the record have been in error. Is it not likely that this will be the case with global warming, too? The ozone layer. This unprecedented assault on the planet's life support system could have horrendous long-term effects on human health, animal life, the plants that support the food chain, and just about every other strand that makes up the delicate web of nature. And it is too late to prevent the damage, which will worsen for years to come. As with the supposed greenhouse effect and global warming, the loss of protective ozone from the upper atmosphere must be addressed here because it looms large in public thinking. In the 1990s, when I tell an audience that population growth does not have the bad economic effects it is commonly believed to have, invariably someone asks, "But what about the ozone layer? What about the greenhouse effect?" If I simply point out that those questions are non sequiturs, the audience thinks the questions are being ducked. The best I can do within the scope of the available space and within my non-expert's knowledge is to try to put the issue in reasonable perspective with respect to human welfare. Much of the sound thinking about global warming and acid rain also fits the ozone layer issue. My guess is that this is most likely to be simply another transient concern, barely worthy of consideration in the next edition of this book. As with global warming, there follows a short list of propositions about the issue. For reliable scholarly assessments, which provide the full background to these propositions, please see E. Singer, 1995. 1. The ozone layer and its hole over Antarctica certainly deserve study, but this is very different than recommending action. The best principle might be, don't do something, stand there. As noted above, when scientists recently warned of global cooling rather than warming, it is important that the government does not attempt to fix what is not broken. 2. The long-run data on ozone show no trends that square with public scares. 3. Concern about the ozone hole is only recent. There has hardly been time for competent researchers to build a body of reliable evidence on which to judge what is happening. 4. Scares come and go. The likelihood that a scare that is only a few years old will turn out to be a truly difficult problem for society is very low, given the record of scares and subsequent debunking shown above. Indeed, the history of one related scare should give special pause to those who are inclined to take action about the ozone layer, the saga of the supersonic transport, SST, airliners. In 1970, the alarm was raised that SSTs would emit water vapor that would destroy ozone. Research then began, but not before critics of the SST were urging that the planes be banned because of their supposed threat to the ozone layer. First, it turned out that the relevant emission was not water vapor, but nitrogen oxides. Then further research showed that, if anything, SSTs would add to the amount of ozone in the stratosphere. Along the way, the consensus of atmospheric scientists began with a prediction of perhaps 6 to 12% negative effect on total ozone as of about 1975, to a 6% positive effect about 1979, to a substantial negative effect again by 1981. The SST scare is dead and gone, though not without causing damage within the scientific and industrial communities. 5. Just as with SSTs, there is great controversy about the threat to the ozone layer now, with some respected scientists arguing that there is nothing to worry about, just as some argue to the contrary. The press tends to report only on those scientists who utter warnings of catastrophe. 6. Volcanic ash and sunspots are cited as possible natural influences on the amount of ozone, along with the human-produced chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, which contain ozone-destroying chlorine. It has been noted that CFCs at the peak production level were only 0.25%, 0.0025, of the amount of chlorine released every year by the sea, which makes the effect of reducing CFCs very questionable. 7. Even if the ozone layer should be thinning right now, it need not be a permanent thinning. If human intervention is causing the change, human intervention can reverse it. 8. Perhaps most important is that even if the ozone layer should be thinning, it need not imply bad effects for humanity. The chief threat seems to be a rise in skin cancers as more of the sun's ultraviolet rays pour through the thinning ozone. But evidence on the geography or the time pattern of skin cancers over the years does not square with the thickness of the ozone layer. And even if a thinner layer implies more skin cancer, all else equal, people can intervene in many ways, even with as simple a remedy as wearing hats more frequently. There is also the possibility that increased ultraviolet radiation stemming from decreased ozone may have beneficial effects in reducing rickets disease, which results from too little sunlight and lack of vitamin D. 9. Banning CFCs, a family of remarkably useful chemicals, especially as refrigerants, runs the risk of raising the cost of refrigeration enough to put it out of the reach of some people in poor countries. We in rich countries who take refrigeration for granted may not be aware of the huge impact on food safety, on variety of diet, and on reduced effort in cooking that refrigeration makes. 10. In 1992, there was an international agreement to stop producing halon as a result of its supposed threat to the ozone layer. Halon is used to fight fires, and no equivalent substitutes for halons have yet reached the American market. Nothing yet made matches halon's ability to put fires out quickly without hurting nearby people or causing further property damage. Yet firms have begun to dismantle their halon systems. It is hard to even imagine how the amount of halon released from such systems could have any meaningful impact on the atmosphere. As is too often the case, the unsubstantiated fear of CFCs in refrigeration systems has led to added regulation of private behavior and new police powers. And as of 1993, the federal government is offering as much as $10,000 for tips that lead it to air conditioning scofflaws. That is, people are being invited to inform the authorities about their neighbors. This, of course, is reminiscent of totalitarian regimes. In the months that this book is being edited, the newspapers are reporting greenhouse effect seems benign so far, and similar news about the ozone effect. So much for the two great scares of the early 1990s. The point is not that these stories represent conclusive proof that the scares are wholly unfounded. Indeed, between now and the next edition of this book, the pendulum could swing back and forth again on these issues, maybe several times. Rather, the point is that it is remarkably imprudent to base any public policies on supposed phenomena whose scientific base is so thin or non-existent that the consensus of scientific belief can change overnight. A personal note. While editing and reviewing the material in this chapter, I found myself shocked by the flimsiness of the scientific arguments that have been adduced with respect to many of these issues, the rapidity with which they were falsified, often by equally flimsy research, and the willingness, even avidity, of the media to promulgate the results of such shoddy work. I thought that after a quarter century of studying these issues and observing this scene, I could not still be shocked by incompetence and dishonesty in science. But the record is so bad that I am newly amazed and again saddened. I find myself wondering whether it is better that the young be unaware of this sordidness so that their faith is not too much lessened, or that they look the truth about human nature, even in science, squarely in the face so that they will know the strength and identity of the enemy. I worry that knowing the extent and the perversity of these happenings will turn them away from science in general. The science, which is, after all, not only our best protection against real dangers and our best prospect for true progress, but also one of the great sources of challenge for the human capacities and the human spirit. We cannot afford to forego these gains and challenges. Summary: biologists, engineers, and environmentalists who have warned of pollution problems and then developed methods of abating those problems have performed a great service to humankind. And warnings about the possible dangers from coal, nuclear energy, medicines, mercury, carbon dioxide, and the like can serve a similar valuable purpose, especially in connection with ill effects that do not appear immediately but only after many years. We must keep in mind, however, that it is not possible to create a civilization that is free of such risks. The best we can do is to be alert and prudent. Exaggerated warnings can be counterproductive and dangerous. The epigraph to this chapter by Walter Hickel is worth pondering. Afternote: healing the planet. The phrase of the 1990s seems to be heal the earth or the planet. It falls from the lips of Jewish rabbis, the only kind, I suppose, Roman Catholic churchmen, Protestant ministers, as well as environmental activists such as Paul Ehrlich, who so named a book. What means this? The phrase seems to suggest that the planet is sick or injured. When one inquires in what way, one learns that the problem is the difference between the way the Earth is now and the way it originally was. The cure is to be found in virgin woods, wilderness untrammeled by the foot of modern woman and man, with all species restored to their numbers before recent times, and without traces of structures built or substances deposited in recent centuries. In short, all evidence of human activity during the last 200 or 2,000 years is to be healed. The only way that this could be done, of course, is to restore the number of human beings to what it was about 10,000 years ago. And the environmental activists, especially Garrett Hardin and Paul Ehrlich, do not shrink from reducing the numbers of human beings. The condition of the planet that they call for has nothing to do with its excellence for human health or living standards. The evidence is overwhelming that people now live more healthily and with more of the material goods they desire than ever in the past. And there is no reason to believe that the trend will not continue in the same direction forever. Obviously, then, healing will not make human life better in the future. It is to be done for the sake of the planet itself, whatever that means. It could not be clearer that the view that the planet needs healing rests entirely upon one set of values. More generally, the call to heal the planet is a feel-good notion, full of sentiment but empty of content and perhaps motivated largely by selfishness.